Friends, Zindabad, Salam, Namaste. I welcome all of you to this very significant evening. Uh, it's uh, we were worried whether people would be drawn to uh, drawn by the concerns of the significance of this day to join us this evening. Clearly, our fears were too well founded, uh, but, but we are delighted that some of you are here. We also want to reassure our panelists that, that we are recording the program this evening, and we hope to put it up, and we hope that over time people see and reflect on what we're going to discuss today. Um, so the context is very well known. 80 years ago, exactly on this day, the course of human history, in a sense, was turned. Um, the Allied forces, the government of the United States, thought it fit to drop a bomb, strangely called Little Boy, uranium driven, I think. Um, and in the flash of a moment, 80,000 lives were destroyed. And in the course of the coming weeks, estimates differ, but anything between 100, 150,000 people got killed. The reason that the United States chose to drop this bomb was to bring Japan to Germany had already surrendered. The war had ended in Europe, but for ending the war in the Pacific, the United States government thought it fit to drop this bomb. I've never been able to understand why they thought it fit to drop a second bomb 3 days later, which was, I think, the fat man bomb in Nagasaki. The world has never been the same after that. The possibility of the annihilation of the entire human race by political decisions by a small number of our leaders is a reality that all of us live with. There are 9 states, I think, which are officially with nuclear weapons. There are some which are suspected to have nuclear weapons. The power and the killing capacity of those nuclear weapons is many times greater than the bombs that were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Some interest globally on this event was stirred by the film Oppenheimer. I must confess to have found that film extremely disappointing because I felt that the moral questions and the moral debate where you have contributed to a slaughter of together maybe 300,000-400,000 people and its continuance over generations. I found that missing, and it is really the moral questions that Hiroshima and Nagasaki leave for the world 80 years later that will be the central concern of this evening. Um, may I invite the first of our panelists, Vinay Lal. As I said, he's a writer, blogger, cultural critic, and a professor of history at UCLA. Vinay will speak on the on the decision, what Penny was talking about, the decision to bomb Hiroshima, how this was represented to the public after the war in the United States. He'll talk about the memorialization of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan and the meanings of Hiroshima at a philosophical, moral, ethical level, thinking about Hiroshima today. So thank you.
All right, so I'll take about 10 or 15 minutes to just share with you some of my reflections on the question of the atomic bombings. I'm doing a book on Hiroshima, but the book will be not just on the atomic bombings, it will be on the imagination of Hiroshima and how to think about the implications of something like the atomic bombings, both in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And as Harsh has mentioned, what I would like to do is just divide my comments into roughly 4 very brief sections. The first has to do with the decision to use the bomb and the planning behind it. I believe that Amar will also speak about it perhaps, and there's already been a little bit of a discussion as it so happens on this question, but I think that I want to put it this way, that there used to be an argument which is an argument that still has a lot of currency in the United States. I don't think it has much currency outside the United States, but in the United States there is still a very substantial number of people who are insistent in holding to the view that the dropping of the bombs was intended to produce the surrender, the unconditional surrender of the Japanese, which would then, of course, bring an end to the war in the Pacific. As opposed to that, I might just share with you a quote from Lieutenant General Leslie Groves, who was the director of the Manhattan Project, right, which led, of course, to the construction of the bomb, where he confessed that, and I quote, "There was never, from about 2 weeks from the time that I took charge of this project," which is several years before the bomb was dropped, "any illusion on my part but that Russia was our enemy, and the project was conducted on that basis," end quote. Right? So we have Groves himself making it very clear that this whole idea that the bomb was intended for the Japanese and was intended to produce a quick outcome is something that obviously he was never a party to that point of view. It's also very interesting that people like General MacArthur, who was the commanding officer for the entire set of forces, Allied forces, he himself was actually never consulted about the bomb at all, right? So just to give you a little illustration, we'll actually have to, if you go through the slides now, it won't make any sense. So we should just go back to the beginning slide, and then I'll take them up, take them up later on. All right. So the proponents of the bomb have talked about the fact that there was a kind of a military necessity. The idea was to try to. It was very clear that if you didn't, from their standpoint, that if you didn't drop the bomb, the first bomb in any case, that the war would drag on, and the argument has been that it saved a great many lives. There's, of course, something perverse about it, partly because about the argument, partly because the supposition is that to save lives, you first have to take lives. And that is a logic that we should think through when we think about what the argument really is. On this question, I just want to actually mention just 2 things. okay, which are related to each other. Why Hiroshima and why Nagasaki? And if we answer the first one, we will have a sense of how to address the question of Nagasaki. So there was what is called the Target Committee. There was a Target Committee, and the Target Committee sat down, and they initially came up with a list of 17 targets. Now, one of the things that is, I think, quite critically important to understand about the atomic bombings is that before these bombings took place, the Japanese had engaged, the Americans, excuse me, had engaged in the firebombing of Japanese cities. All right? And the firebombing of Japan, of Tokyo, in mid-March of 1945, in fact, caused more casualties than the atomic bombing of either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Right? But almost no one speaks about the firebombings of Tokyo, and it's also necessary to add that there were 15 other major Japanese cities which were all firebombed, including Osaka and Nagoya, okay, and so on. Right? And of course, we have to ask ourselves, what is the difference? And this is something I'm going to come to when I speak about what are the moral, ethical implications of thinking about Hiroshima, why it is that why there is a different kind of moral transgression involved there. Because if you're simply going by numbers, it's very clearly the case that the atomic bombings of either city didn't produce the kind of outcome that the firebombings produced of Japanese cities produced. And Japanese cities were particularly vulnerable, partly because the material that is used in construction in Japanese homes is extremely combustible, because we're talking about wood and paper for the most part. All right? But the fundamental thinking, let me get to the gist of this part of my talk, is that they wanted to actually be able to calculate the effect of the bomb. So when the Target Committee sat down, they said, well, we have to eliminate such cities such as Tokyo and Osaka and Nagoya and Fukushima and so on. We have to eliminate these because these cities have already been leveled. So if you drop a bomb on any one of these cities, how are you going to be able to actually measure the impact? And so therefore, to use a phrase that I used in one of my writings on Hiroshima, they were working essentially with a conception of virgin territory. And so Hiroshima and Nagasaki were among the handful of Japanese cities that had been left untouched. And that is why after the Enola Gay dropped the bomb, there was a second aircraft, and that the picture that you have of the mushroom cloud is taken from the photographer in the second plane who had the instruments with which they measured the impact of the bomb. Right? And I use that phrase virgin territory with obviously some provocation, because we have to understand, of course, certain notions of masculinity and militarism when we're looking at something like war, and particularly when you're looking at something like Hiroshima. Now, the second set of questions, very broadly, that I think merit some attention is the question of what are the public representations of Hiroshima. It's obviously a very vast subject, right? And I myself have been surprised over the years by things I have found, including the fact that merely 2 months after the Hiroshima-Nagasaki bombings, don't type this question into AI, because AI doesn't even recognize a question of this kind. I just undertook this exercise this morning and got an astounding answer, because AI claimed that what I was asking was completely false. In fact, AI is completely false on this. That is at 2 months, because I've got a whole lot of pictures on this. 2 months after the bombings, the commercialization of the atomic bomb as something you could market to create a market for other goods was already starting in the United States. For example, atomic cafes. Okay, cafes that were opening up in Nebraska, in Omaha, in states all across the Midwest where they were selling atomic orange juice. Right? So if you're thinking about the public representations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we can move in that direction as well. All right? But what we have to really begin with is something that Truman said. When the information was conveyed to him, he was on the cruiser Augusta, and the news was given to him, the bomb has been dropped. And he said, is it successful? And he was told, yes, it's immensely successful according to our measurements. And he immediately said, and I quote, "This is the greatest thing in history." These are his words. This is the greatest thing in history. Oppenheimer himself, there's a lot of discussion about Oppenheimer. Harsh had mentioned the movie. There's a lot of discussion about Oppenheimer and the guilt he may have experienced and so on. It is worthwhile pondering simply over the fact that immediately after the bomb was dropped, and for some days thereafter, he said that the atomic bombs represented the greatest achievement of organized science in history. That was the view that he had at that time. All right? Now, in October 1945, a very large survey was undertaken. So we're speaking 2 months after the bombs. In the United States, 85% of Americans declared themselves in favor of the atomic bombing. 23% of them said there should have been more atomic bombs that should have been dropped. 23%. This is in October 1945. A Pew survey that was undertaken in 2015 shows that the needle has shifted somewhat, but 56% of Americans still declared themselves in support of the American decision to nuke Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 34% declared themselves not in support. In Japan, that same survey actually posed the question in Japan, and 14% declared themselves in favor of the bombings, and 79% opposed. All right? Now, another way to think about, obviously, the question of the public representations of Hiroshima, and here it's in Japan itself that I'm really looking at. I just want to share with you very quickly a series of slides. So these are called the Hiroshima panels. These panels are done, there are 15 such panels, folding panels done between 1950 and 1982. Each of them is 1.8 times 7.2 meters, so these are very large works. Largely done using the Japanese technique of sumie, which is Japanese black and white ink drawings, contrasted with the red, which you'll see in some of the other panels, the red of the atomic fire. And these panels are all done by a couple, Maruki Iri, an artist who was born in 1901, joined the proletarian art movement, and after the war joined the Communist Party, from which he was expelled because he opposed all nuclear testing, including that of the Soviet Union. And so for that public position, he was actually expelled from the Communist Party there. He married a woman by the name of Toshi, so she's Maruki Toshi, who was born in 1912. She came from the family of a Buddhist priest, taught at an art school in Tokyo. They were married in 1941, and they started doing these murals in 1948. Iri Maruki, the man, actually went to Hiroshima 3 days after the bomb had fallen, right? And, witnessed what was obviously a landscape which, as he says, was a field of rubble, complete and total, where fires were burning almost everywhere, right? So these murals, we'd have to dim the lights, the quality would have to be much better, but you'll get a sense of it because a lot of these artists, when you see this work, And you'll see, by the way, in most of the Hiroshima art, you'll see that the bodies are all naked. And they're all naked because most people, their clothes, they were just stripped of the clothes by the sheer power of the bomb. And that's one of the reasons why you see them absolutely stark naked. All right? Many of them had their flesh was hanging from them, bodies were swollen. I mean, there are these absolutely gruesome photographs of eyes that have been hollowed out because the sockets were pulled out with the force of the bomb. Right? But here, as opposed to the documentary film that you saw, what you're really seeing, and we didn't see the second half of the film where you see people with burns and this and that. What you're seeing here is a representation of this, and this one is called Ghosts because everybody seemed like a ghost to the artists. Everybody walking around, in an absolute kind of stupor at Hiroshima. So we can move to the next one, and there you see the fire. So they're still using black and white ink, but you see the red of the blood, the red of the fire, of the flames. And this one is called Fire. If we could go to the next one. This one is called Water. There's a whole book that can be written about water and Hiroshima. Hiroshima is a city of 7 rivers, if you've ever been there. And of course, what many people sought to do was to jump into the water. Well, the temperature of the water was 6,000 centigrade. So you just completely burnt. And there were thousands of bodies just floating in the rivers. People who had jumped into the rivers in the hope that they would actually be able to cool down from the temperature. So this mural is called Water. And then if we can go to the next one, this one is called Young Boys and Girls. And once again, you see a huddle of bodies. This huddle of bodies, by the way, is reminiscent of Auschwitz and the concentration camps. And it's very interesting that these two artists, one of the murals that it's not part of this series, but they did another mural which is actually on Auschwitz. Right? So they began to, later on in their life, they began to sort of think about, what might possibly link something like Hiroshima to something like Auschwitz, but this is what this mural is. We're only seeing 4 out of the 15 panels here, and in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the other ones because I had images of other kinds of art which I captured myself when I was in Hiroshima and Nagasaki on my last visit, which was last year. The last thing I really want to touch upon is the more philosophical question of the meanings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What we're all obviously thinking about, but this is not really distinct to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is the concept of total war, right? And when you have a concept of total war, nothing is impermissible, right? There are no boundaries. There are no sacred areas which cannot be transgressed. What we're also speaking about, but again, this is not particular to Hiroshima, so we would still have to understand what is it that makes Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what is it that makes them different, but we do have to think obviously about dehumanization. I think it's worthwhile reflecting upon the fact that the bombs were thrown upon an Asiatic people, and we have to understand the kind of sentiments that were dominant in the American population with regard to Asiatics more broadly, not just the Japanese, but Asiatics more broadly. The chairman of the U.S. War Manpower Commission, Paul McNutt, said, and I'm quoting his words, he favored the extermination of the Japanese in toto, entirely, end quote, right? And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the American president's own son, supported the continuation of the war, quote, until we have destroyed about half of the civilian population. These are his words. This is the son of FDR. So, we would have to think again about all of that as part of the climate that engendered the very possibility of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I think the fundamental question cannot be answered if we really think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki simply alongside scores of other atrocities of our times, including, for example, what is happening in Gaza at the present moment. I don't think we would really be able to comprehend what it is that is really different about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I've found it interesting that the Western imagination, which has been so fertile in thinking about Auschwitz, has not really been able to think through the question of Hiroshima. So, for example, recall that Adorno very famously had this cryptic, enigmatic observation in his book called Minima Moralia, which I strongly recommend. I mean, it's one of the masterpieces of 20th century literature, Reflections from a Damaged Life. And what did he say? Quote, there can be no poetry after Auschwitz, right? He doesn't say there can be no poetry after Hiroshima, right? Because Hiroshima didn't resonate for some reason in the Western imagination in the same way. There wasn't an adequate sense that a different kind of moral transgression had taken place, right? And that's why I began with the observation that the fire bombings of Japanese cities, actually Tokyo especially, caused more casualties than either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Not the two of them taken together, of course, but either Hiroshima or Nagasaki, right? So I end with these questions, rather than, because each of these can be explored at great length. What happens when lives become a calculus of cause and effect? Who is the victor? Who is the defeated? Is it really clear? Is it victory that is really triumphant, or is it victory that is really catastrophic? And catastrophic for the victor, not just for the defeated. Yeah? What can it mean that we have become omnipotent and impotent at the same time? We become omnipotent because you can annihilate an entire country with the kinds of bombs that are available today. And yet we are impotent because there seems to be an inability to think about the nuclear question and what it might possibly mean, right? And I think that we have to end with the awareness, of course, that the atomic bombings and the nuclear age is incommensurable with all prior history. It's completely incommensurable with all prior history, because once you're in the nuclear age, you're never out of it. You're never out of it. There's no going back, so to speak, and then we will have to ask ourselves, do we have the psychological and philosophical maturity to live with the bomb for all eternity? Thank you.
Thank you, Vinay. I think the description, but the moral questions that you raised at the end, we'll come back to them. But they're very profound. I call upon our second panelist, Pamela Philippos. Many of us, all of us would be familiar with her. She's one of our most respected senior veteran journalists. She's ombudsperson of The Wire. She said she will connect 3 personal encounters with the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Incidentally, Scroll carried a story, 2 stories, 2 very personal stories written by Vinay Lal about an extraordinary man who actually survived both the Hiroshima and the Nagasaki bombings. and the man who dropped the bombs. It's in scroll today. Um, Pamela will bring us 3 personal encounters with the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. First, post 1989, after India's Pokhran, a Hibakusha, I'm not pronouncing it correctly, is the name, Japanese name given to a person who survived the bombings, visited India and painted what he imagined was a moment of the explosion, an intimate meeting with 2 women, Hibakushis, on the peace boat, etc. And finally, a visit to Hiroshima herself directly in 2019. So Pam will, I think, share with us her personal engagement with the tragedy, with the enormous, unimaginable tragedy of Hiroshima.
Thank you, Vinay, for really actually forcing us to confront the horror again of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The point is that it never goes away. We're all living in the after effects of Hiroshima, and I don't think we can ever get away from that. So mine is going to be a very, in comparison with what Vinay was telling us, mine is just a quiet recollection of some of these moments. This is a moment branded in human memory, and today we look back 80 years later, its boundless terror still reverberates in our consciousness. For me, there were 3 personal encounters with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I need to acknowledge here the role of my husband, Achin Vanayak, an anti-nuclear activist, in sensitizing me to this issue. Unfortunately, he could not be here today because he was speaking at another event. The first encounter took place after May 11, 1998, when the Prime Minister, Mr. Vajpayee, announced to the world that India had detonated a 2-stage thermonuclear bomb. The announcement shocked the world, most especially Japan's community of anti-nuclear activists. An atom bomb survivor, Hibakusha in Japanese, gave me a painting at that point that captured, to his mind, the aftermath of the bomb. It was painted in bright colors, but I think the black color, the darkness that we saw in the murals that Vinay presented to us captures perhaps a dimension that Taketa-san's depiction does not. But even as you look at it, you see this amazing balloon that spreads across the sky. Can you imagine looking at that with its tail of ash and sparks following it? It was something that he said was so mind-numbing that he can repeat it again and again to try and convey to the world the horror of what he had seen. I wanted here to share it with you all. A ball of red which ballooned in the sky, its mass spreading infinitely, its tail lashing fire and smoke. As one of the creators of that bomb recognized, this is the personification of death. I am become death, the destroyer of the world, said Oppenheimer. As Harsh and Vinay have, sort of looked at this man a little more closely, he became a hero of sorts in a Hollywood sort of way. His words have become denuded of the horror of what they describe. In fact, it has only added to his supposed charisma. One man who killed millions for his country, how awesome. And the man knew Hindu scriptures What more do we want? There's a glorification here of this word, I am become death. 14 years later, in 2014, I had the opportunity, 16 years later, in 2014, I had the opportunity to interview two Hibakushas, Matsunga Seijuka and Iskawa Ritsoko, on the Peace Boat, a unique institution that took the message of banning the bomb across the world. The community of Hibakushas, or survivors of the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is dwindling for obvious reasons. While they had strength, many among them made it a point to share their experiences of living through that moment with the rest of the world in order to ensure that nobody would have to suffer their fate. Shisuza-san was a schoolgirl of 13, and Ritsuka-san just 1.5 years, when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. It wiped out, I don't have to go into, I think everyone's repeated the data, so I don't have to say it, but like Harsh pointed out, there was Nagasaki also. We talk of Hiroshima because it was the first, but Nagasaki also suffered more than 50,000 killings. Shizusa-san remembers that on that particular day, she was not in school. Her mother had wanted her to help on a work site of dismantling fallen buildings to create a fire break. Lots of Japanese school children were doing that to create so that fires would not spread from one to another. So these children used to break down, houses in between. And she was doing that. And because her mother had told her to do that, maybe that's why she lived to tell her tale. Because the work site was about 2.1 kilometers from the hypocenter of the explosion, while the school was just 1.4 kilometers away. Since she was working under the open sky, she actually saw the plane in the sky. And it's interesting. She saw it as a white line stretching across with a glittering tip. It was about 8:15 a.m., she recalled. She also remembered registering the fact that it was a B-29. School children of Japan were aware of B-29s because this was not the first bombing, of course, as Vinay has just told us. They were familiar enough. When the explosion happened, she shut her eyes and appeared to have blacked out. By the time she regained consciousness, her world had been reduced to ashes, as we saw in the panels. Everything seemed gray, she said. There was no sound of birds singing. She also felt the burning sensation on the side of her face that faced the sky, and smelled the distinct odor of her burnt hair. As the petrified girl staggered to her feet and tried to find her way back, a big mushroom cloud had formed over the city. Its central column bloating and changing shape, she said, all the time it changed. It looked as if it would swoop down on me. There were debris around her, and fires raged at every corner. Some adults who recognized her tried to calm her, but everyone alive were in a state of stupor, in a state of shock, desperate for water. When she got home, she found a major part of her house had collapsed. She recalled seeing her mother as having her cheek muscles broken open like a pomegranate, and her upper half of the body covered with blood. Her grandmother had been lifted by the blast and brought down under a falling wardrobe. She died soon after. As the family struggled to pull itself out, the full impact of that catastrophe began to reveal itself. Of the 300 students in her school, at least 200 had been killed. It was decided that those students who had survived that attack would help gather the bodies of those who had perished on the premises of the school. Many of them the bodies bore keloids or scar tissue. We had to carry these bodies to the ground of a nearby temple on planks of wood with no special protection. Nobody knew how dangerous such an exposure was. Ritsuka-san, the other woman, had no direct memories of that morning, being only a baby. But Hiroshima also marked her out in distinct and terrible ways. Her father and aunt went missing, and her mother fell ill 7 years later and died. So she became what was known as a Hiroshima orphan. She revealed a little-known side of the Hiroshima story, the discrimination meted out to A-bomb survivors, which in turn impacted their future. Ritsuka-san, who had never married, recalled that at a time when she was looking to settle down, potential bridegrooms would inquire if she was a Hibakusha and then shy away. Her elder sister, who wanted to work in Tokyo, couldn't get a job there because she always had to reveal that she was from Hiroshima. The discrimination was subtle, she said, but it was there in the aftermath of the bomb attacks. Residents of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were considered liabilities, much like our Dalits, perhaps. They were marked by that event. The presumption was that people from these cities would be susceptible and die. Relating personal histories to strangers is often a painful task. They both said that, both the women I spoke to. But as the generation that experienced Hiroshima and Nagasaki at first hand passes away, as memories fade, and with them the horror of those twin nuclear attacks, they understood how crucial it is that they keep telling their stories. The person who painted those panels was also driven by that telling of that story to keep it alive. The third part of my account, and I'll be brief now, happened in 2019 when I visited Hiroshima. We were always keenly aware that we were going as tourists, but through it all, the shadow of that mushroom pillar never left our side. The museum at the Peace Memorial Park held glimpses of that day. One of the earliest photographs taken shortly after the bomb was dropped showed dazed people around a water pump against a shattered cityscape. Some sat on the road, their faces completely blackened, their clothes in shreds. Others rushed to pour some water from a local fountain over their burning bodies. There's another terrifying piece of evidence, a human shadow etched on the stone steps of a bank. Some unfortunate being sitting on that step was exposed to the atomic explosion at close range and was literally vaporized. His remains remain as a shadow on the stone. These are all carefully assembled pieces of garments worn by victims, a coat, a military uniform, what looked like a lady's dress, a child's smock. They're shredded, but they spoke out loudly. A delicate pendant that once adorned a young woman's neck miraculously remained intact. Someone's scarf, someone's shoe. That life was so abruptly cut short, mid-stride, came across in melted dishes, mangled cutlery, twisted wristwatches, clocks that captured that exact moment. A lady's purse with a few coins surviving to tell a tale. But the heart-stopping moments were when you come to the section of those unfortunates who happened to be within a 1,000-meter radius of the hypocenter and who lingered a few weeks on the verge of death from a condition termed in those days as radiation sickness. According to what was reported to medics, symptoms ranged from the falling of hair, inflammation of the mouth and throat, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, and internal hemorrhaging, which led to red spots appearing to the on the face and body. And when those spots appeared, you knew that that person was going to die. These came to be known as the spots of death because they foretold that person's death. The importance of telling these stories is to remind the world the unique and terrifying consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. 80 years later, this telling has become even more urgent given the state of the world today. Vinay is right. We perhaps cannot compare it with what is happening around us. But we continue to live the aftershock of Hiroshima, as reflected in the genocide in Gaza, in military confrontations around the world, including at our borders. Any of these may at any moment take on a nuclear dimension. And I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam, for those really moving stories and images, which I think will stay with us. The human experience of an atomic bomb, what it does to your lives, I think we got a little glimpse of that. I now call our third panelist, Dr. Amar Farooqi. He's a retired professor of history in Delhi University. Very respected for his progressive interpretations. He will go back to that very specific question: why did the Americans drop the bomb? Why did they use it in Japan? What was the military doctrine of targeting civilians, non-combatants on such a big scale? So yes, Aman.
Thank you, Harsha. I'll begin on a personal note. I became familiar with this word radioactivity when I was about 10 years old, when my mother took me to see a film, a Bombay Hindustani film, Aman, which is perhaps the only film I know of which is made on, the only Bombay film made on a theme like this. But when I saw the film, before I went to the film, my mother tried to give me a little bit of a background because she realized that someone, I was in class 4 or 5, would really not be able to understand some of the implications of what that film was about. It was a very typical kind of film, but yet it was also a film which had, which was made with some sort of concern about conveying the message of peace, of the horrors of atomic bombing, of radioactivity, and it was, of course, very difficult for my mother to explain, what radioactivity was and how it affected people, but nevertheless, many of the images stayed with me. That was my introduction, really, to Hiroshima, that something very horrible had happened at a place in Japan called Hiroshima. Incidentally, much later, I read about something that was there in the film. Right at the beginning of the film, there's a 2-minute scene of Bertrand Russell talking to Rajendra Kumar, who's the hero who goes to Japan to work among patients of the nuclear bombing. And only recently I read in a biography of Rajendra Kumar that they had to, the effort that they had to put in to go to England to interview Bertrand Russell for that little 2-minute clip, which I thought was commendable because it at least showed that whatever the shortcomings of the film, they had, they were very serious in their intent about, conveying this message of peace and nuclear disarmament with which Bertrand Russell was associated. This film had come in 1967, and I might also mention that this was also the time when, during the Vietnam War, there were regular sort of demonstrations that would take place, that would be taking place in Delhi, protest demonstrations. My parents would be going there, and the idea that Americans possessed weapons which could inflict enormous misery on people. Remember, this is just when My Lai had happened, around that time, when a little after that, that image of the girl running, after the napalm bombing, so that, some of those things were, a way of, for me to really understand what this kind of violence really meant. Now, I'm not a student of science, and that's a big handicap if one tries to understand what an atom bomb is. From whatever sort of little I know, the radioactivity was something that became known in the 1890s, and then during the interwar period, during the 20s and 1930s, scientists had acquired sufficient sort of through experiments and understanding of the atom, also that splitting of an atom produces energy, that this energy, that this can be sort of used for setting in motion a chain reaction, which once it gathers momentum has enormous force, which can then have the possibility of also unleash enormous destructive power. Although the sort of leap is not so simple to think in terms of that power and then to think in terms of its destructive power requires a certain kind of sort of thinking to, how you can utilize this energy for destructive purposes. I mean, we still have that continuous debate about nuclear power, nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, nuclear energy for destructive purposes. So scientists were obviously very early during the 30s, 1930s, able to figure out that this has enormous destructive potential. And that was obviously of great interest to powerful states. And I'll come to that in a moment. But there's another point, I think, which, again, as somebody who's not really from science, it was something which I didn't really understand for quite some time, why all this talk about uranium, until I, read up on it and I, talked to people. I realized that actually uranium is one of the few substances which is amenable to this kind of chain reaction, and that uranium is in short supply. So that also, in fact, one of the things that the Americans were trying to do, Leslie Groves, was very keen to monopolize all sources of uranium. And he thought he had more or less achieved that by the time the bomb was thrown at, was exploded at, unleashed on Japan. So it's also important to remember that this is research which was the cumulative sort of product of a large number of scientists working in laboratories in different parts of the world. In in Britain, which was initially really at the forefront of a lot of this research, America, of course, Germany, Italy, scientists, from Italy, from Denmark, from Hungary, from Russia, and also in a limited way from Japan. So this is also in a way the product, the knowledge about the atom and what the atom can do and how it can be used for destructive purposes is something which scientists from different countries really were able to produce. But United States and Britain and Germany were really at the forefront of a lot of this research. And by the 1930s, and this is expensive research, as most of you realize, so it was only countries which had the necessary resources. This is not really, and that's where we need to really think of our own priorities also. This is not really a third world project. Third world countries need to really think of the enormous resources that are involved in producing an atom bomb. But by the late 30s, by 38, 39, just around the time that the war was began, scientists did have an understanding, at least in some working in Germany, working in Britain, working in America, had an understanding of how the atom could be used to, how atomic energy could be used to produce a very, very powerful bomb of the like, which was very different from conventional bombs. I'll come to that point towards the end of what I have to say. But it's just when the war had begun, it's just around that time. So, the two things really come together, and the war itself accelerates further research on the project. I think it's important to remember the Second World War context. So by 38, 39, a lot of this knowledge is available to scientists. There are laboratories, but they are not really there. They are not in a position really to produce a bomb or all that goes into the making of a bomb. And that required political military intervention. So it's a political military project. It's a project of scientists. It's not scientists work sitting alone in a laboratory producing a bomb. It requires enormous resources to produce the bomb. And by 1940, 41, already there's a lot of discussion going on. I wouldn't say a lot of discussion, but at least there's some preliminary discussion, I should say, about producing a bomb. And by October 1941, I think that's crucial, Roosevelt has given the green signal for research to be conducted on the bomb. The date is important. Pearl Harbor had not yet happened. So this justification, which was a later justification, that it was Pearl Harbor, it was the declaration. So October is December 8, 1941 is when Pearl Harbor, the first week of December 1941, Pearl Harbor, and within 2 or 3 days, Germany also declares war on the United States. So this decision has already been taken for conducting research on nuclear science for producing the bomb. And then, of course, what follows is when I was talking about the Manhattan Project. So in 1942, the Manhattan Project is is already on track. And it's important again to remember that Manhattan Project is a project which is under the control of the Army. It is the engineers corps of the American Army which actually controls it. Leslie Groves is a military officer. who is sort of given a great deal of authority to supervise this massive project, which once it started going, it involved almost 5 lakh people working on it, directly or indirectly. A large amount of labor went into it. Almost 1% of the working population of America during the wartime was engaged in this project. So it's a huge, huge project spread over a large area. Some, of course, the best known is Los Alamos, but then there are sites, there are at least 4 major sites where this work is going on, but then there are sites which are sort of connected to that. And so it's sort of spread over a very large area, using up a huge amount of resources. Something which, at that point of time, only Americans could really manage. There is, of course, the story of the Germans being engaged in the project. And that became, in a sense, the justification. I mean, of course, the Americans were really sort of worried that the Germans would be able to produce a bomb. And there's that famous sort of letter of Einstein, which has actually nothing to do with the bomb, frankly. I mean, that, it says nothing about the bomb or the 1939 letter that he wrote to Roosevelt, pointing out that Germany is engaged in a lot of research which might have very serious consequences, but it has nothing. All that it says is that there should be greater interaction between the administration and scientists who are working on this project. That's all it says. It has nothing to say about the bomb. So by 41, the decision is taken. 42, the project is has taken off. And this is a huge project, of course, and I won't there's no point in getting into the details, but there are 1 or 2 things I think which need to be mentioned. One is, of course, that, I mean, this is a very, very well-known figure because it is quoted so frequently, that $2 billion were spent on this project for producing the bomb. But it's also important to remember that simultaneously there's another project going on, which is the project which is slightly more expensive, the project to produce, to make the B-29 Superfortress bomber. So you must have a plane. Of course, when that project was launched, it was not for the bomb. As the bomb project took off, and as this project of manufacturing B-29s, this is a Boeing, the Boeing company eventually got the contract for it, incidentally, and this project is going sort of accelerated. The B-29 bomber project, this very sort of state-of-the-art, very efficient, long-distance, flying long-haul aeroplane is being developed simultaneously. This was an even more expensive project. The B-29 cost $3 billion. So to the cost of the $2 billion, you need a plane to drop the bomb. And in the final stages, 44, 45, when the final sort of, the B-29 is in the final stages of it, it's being experimented with, and the problems that it has are being resolved. The 2 projects are actually working close together because it's necessary to make out how the bomb would be carried, and therefore the B-29 must be properly be able to do that. So these projects are actually going on simultaneously. The B-29 bombing, although B-29 was used for dropping other bombs, Vinay told us about the ferocious bombing of Japanese cities which had been taking place, tens of thousands of people being killed in those just before the Hiroshima bombing actually took place. So those are the B-29 bombers which are doing this work. And incidentally, and when I mentioned this virgin areas or locations where the bomb has to be dropped, the constant discussion that is going on just on the eve of the decision to drop the bomb, the atom bomb, is that we should ensure that there are a few large cities which are left where this bombing does not take place. So to assess the impact of the atomic bomb, you really need a city which has not, to which too much damage has not already been done. You need to have that kind of city. So that's the virgin city, that's the virgin location that when I was talking about. In any case, so by July 1945, the bomb has been tested in the New Mexico desert, and the decision is gradually being taken about dropping the bomb. Now, there are 2 or 3 things which I think need to be underlined over here, and I'll just speak about that before coming to 1 or 2 concluding remarks. One is that this is also something Vin had mentioned, but I think it needs to be underlined, that Berlin had already fallen in the first week of May 1945. The Germans have surrendered. And we should keep in mind that it would not have been militarily a difficult thing to destroy Japanese military power, particularly after the surrender the Nazi surrender in May. So the war in Europe is over. And it's something that, in fact, necessitates speeding up the process of building the bomb and testing it. If the war comes to an end too soon, it will become difficult to justify throwing the bomb. So things have to be speeded up. It's actually interesting that the most hectic discussions, consultations are taking place between May and July, when the decision is end of July, when the decision is finally taken. The test is on the 16th of July in New Mexico of the bomb. And just see the haste with which this whole thing is proceeding. That haste is something which is dictated by the very fact that the war has come to an end in Europe. And it's around that time that scientists who have been associated with this project begin to express grave concerns over the possible use. They don't know that the decision is being taken. That's how the military establishment is thinking in terms of this bomb that has been produced. They are thinking in terms of now using it. And that makes many scientists who are who were part of this project in some way or the other, they get worried about this. And it's around this time that I think it's in June that you have scientists who are based in the University of Chicago at the metallurgy lab who produce a report which is usually known as the Frank report, which is then sent to the president, saying that we need to consider the consequences of what will happen if a bomb is actually used. We have produced a bomb, but don't use it. That's what these scientists are saying. We've produced a bomb, but don't use this bomb. It will have disastrous consequences. It will lead to an armaments race, which will be disastrous, which will be catastrophic. The report is, Peggy was referring to, the documentation. A vast amount of documentation is now very easily available, including this memorandum or this report. But very categorical. It was, by the way, it was censored. And even now, you can see this if the digital copies are available online, and you can actually see that the censor has done a very good job, despite the fact that it is declassified. There are sentences which are struck out in a way that it's impossible to read what has been said. There's one particular sentence which follows the statement where the scientists are saying that, well, this was made because there was a fear that the Germans would produce a bomb. And then there's a sentence which has been struck out, which can't be read precisely because the censor has done the work. Even though this is declassified, you can't really figure out what is written over there. So the point, this particular document is very important, coming at a time when the bomb is just about to be tested, and it is sort of talking in terms of the bomb not being used. It's alerting the authority, the military establishment, the president, that this bomb should not be used. Incidentally, Roosevelt had died in April, and Truman then had taken over. So this, and there are one or two other things they say. Said even if you want to try out this bomb, that's important. Don't do it by throwing it over a city. Do it in some desert area, uninhabited area. The point is, don't kill with this bomb. Don't use it for killing. It's going to cause such enormous damage that it should not be used for killing, even if you want to test it. To begin with, don't test it. It's too dangerous. And if you test it, then you must not sort of test it by throwing it on a city. So this, but Truman, and Vinay again talked about this, is say, a few days after the bomb was after the bombing of Nagasaki, he wrote a letter to a priest where he's saying, remember what happened in Pearl Harbor? So this is revenge. And then he goes on to say, a beast must be treated like a beast. The racial connotations of that is something that we must keep in mind. Incidentally, there was to be a third bomb, which was ready. But Truman had already decided that there should be no further bombing. In the end, I just want to mention, just about 2 days back, that this is something that it's not something that happened 80 years ago. It's still there. About just 2 days ago, there was a news about an island which is very close to Hiroshima by the name of Ninoshima. It's a small island, short distance from main Hiroshima, where a number of people who were trying to escape from Hiroshima went and tried to take shelter, but a large number of them died in Ninoshima. And there are people who are still searching for the remains of survivor over there. And there was a moving story of an 83-year-old survivor from Hiroshima, woman who has been searching for a child whom she had seen, a 3-year-old child whom she had seen when this bombing took place, who was in the neighborhood, and she has been searching for her. And they found the remains of a small 3-year-old child, a jaw and some other remains, and took it to her, saying that, well, this might be that 3-year-old girl whom you had sort of seen about 80 years ago. And there's this photograph, just an Associated Press story, where she is standing before, a small container where these bones are shown to her, and she is sort of praying and offering her tribute to them, which I thought, it was really very, very, very moving kind of story, and that photograph was moving. So it's still, very much a reality, so much so that, this whole thing of, civilians and non-combatants being targeted in large numbers. Of course, colonial wars, they had already taught Europeans how to, target non-civilians in large numbers, or in Africa, in Asia, and other parts of the world. So that was something that they were not really much bothered about. But the insensitivity, I think, the utter lack of compassion which this kind of bombing reflected is something that is there with us today, particularly when we see in Gaza children going to aid centers to get sort of food, and being bombed is something which I think, is part of that way in which human, society and states think of, human lives. Thank you.